Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. In my new novel, Spellbound, I feature a conversation between the Matilda character and her neighbor, Mrs. Purvis, which pretty much sets the theme for the novel. And in this conversation between Matilda and Mrs. Purvis, she talks about the neighborhood of Sugar Hill and the history of the neighborhood. And during that conversation, she talks about how what you see in this neighborhood is a reflection of how these black people see themselves. Because what you see in many of these inner city neighborhoods regarding these crumbling buildings, the dirty streets, the garbage strewn about, this is a reflection of how many of these black people see themselves. Because when it comes down to your neighborhood, what you see in that neighborhood is reflected in how these black people see and perceive themselves. And because many of your Afro-American Negroes have a low self-esteem, a low self-worth, and do not value anything about themselves, they don't value anything in their communities. And because they don't value anything in the communities, they let things go because they have no personal connection to anything. They don't care about anything because they have not been taught to value themselves. Because this is the big problem in your black community. The people don't value themselves, so they don't value their community. So they pretty much let their community fall apart. Because people who value their community, this is not about money. And this is one of the big problems that many of these Negroes will sit there and tell you, oh, we don't have no money to clean up our community. If we had more money, we'd clean up the community. And that's not the case at all, because I can go back to the Jim Crow period in the same neighborhood where I set the novel Spellbound, and I can give you a completely different picture of that community. Now, if you go back to the neighborhood that Spellbound is set in, which is part of the neighborhood it's set in, Sugar Hill. Sugar Hill was a big part of Harlem. This was a black neighborhood that was pretty much established by black people. Most of the black elite lived up on the top of Sugar Hill, like your great musicians and your great writers. And then you had a middle class of black people who lived in Sugar Hill. These were the Pullman porters. These were the maids. And they saved their money to pretty much buy these brownstones and rent the apartments in many of them in that Harlem neighborhood. And yes, these people didn't have a lot of money, but they had built up a community where they worked together to maintain a quality of life in that community. And because those people had a sense of self-esteem and a sense of self-worth regarding themselves, they managed to keep that community clean. They managed to make it a place where they could raise children and have families and pretty much, have a neighborhood where people work together. And they had a nice middle class of black businesses and black home ownership in that area of Sugar Hill. And what happened over time was that many of these Negroes didn't learn to value themselves. And because they didn't value themselves and what their parents worked for during the Jim Crow period, they started to think that the white man's ice was colder. They didn't learn that, look, your father is being called all sorts of N-words and all sorts of things on this train, being a Pullman porter or a janitor, to give you a home, to send you to school with nice, clean clothes, to make sure that there's food on the table. Your mother and father are doing that so that you can have, a nice life. But because they sat there and watched TV and they started seeing white people, having those picket fences on shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, they thought that was a better life for them. So instead of them staying in their community and continuing to invest in the community the way their mothers and fathers did, they all thought going into the white neighborhood would make them more socially acceptable. And because they did that, what happened was most of the black people were aspiring to leave. And what really gave them incentive to leave was after the assassination of your Dr. Martin Luther King and those riots that happened that pretty much led to a lot of these neighborhoods being torn apart by other black people because, again, they saw white as better and they wanted to be with white people. And they thought being with white people would be more acceptable. And when they started pushing the trend of integration, black people started saying their own neighborhoods didn't have value. So instead of staying and keeping investing in their own neighborhoods, they decided to go over to the white neighborhoods. And pretty much after the riots, they had the incentive to leave. So those neighborhoods pretty much fell apart. And what we see in these neighborhoods, again, is a reflection of how they see themselves. Because when it comes down to this Negro, he does not value black. He does not see black as having a value. He does not see black as having a worth unless it is related to white. And in order for him to see something having value, he has to see a white man telling him he has value. This is how your Afro-American Negro is spellbound, because he thinks that the white man's ice is colder, the white man's policies are more acceptable. And this is one of the reasons why he turned his neighborhood into a ghetto, because you had these white liberals telling him that his neighborhood was a ghetto when it really was never a ghetto. These neighborhoods and all this property can be anything you want it to be. If you have the imagination and the vision, like those black people had during the Jim Crow period, one of the most oppressive periods in American history, to go out here and build your own neighborhood, then it shows that you can make your neighborhood anything you want it to be. Unfortunately, because the Afro-American Negro is spellbound and thinks white is better, he's trying to turn his neighborhood into ghettos because it fits the white liberals' narrative for what black is, and because he wants to fit into the white liberals' box for black, he turns everything into a ghetto. Because these days we see this even with many of these hip-hop entertainers and even many of these regular black entertainers. They still adopt ghetto ways of thinking because they think it's socially acceptable as black. They have transposed the idea of ghetto into black culture, and that's not black culture at all. That has absolutely nothing to do with your black culture. Your black culture these days, as I see it, has been corrupted by white liberals, and because it's been corrupted by white liberals, we don't see the true black culture. Because when you look at the roots and the history of the black culture, and you see what black people did during Jim Crow, it's amazing. I mean, black people had neighborhoods, they had businesses, they had families, they had, people teaching culture to about their own history and stuff to each other. But when we get to the civil rights period in the 1960s and the 1970s, we see that because blacks, the second generation of blacks, wanted to fit into white culture, we see blacks turning their culture and making it into all the stereotypes that many of these racists said are true about black people. And they turn their neighborhoods into a ghetto because that's what white people have said black neighborhoods are supposed to be. Black neighborhoods were not ghettos. They were made into ghettos by white liberals who wanted to have the smooth world. They wanted to create a black culture that made them feel comfortable about black people. And black people, instead of fighting back like those people did in Jim Crow, did against those stereotypes by saying, we're not going to be this, we're going to be what we want to be, not what you want us to be. Instead, these black people followed lockstep in that ragdoll dance, entranced, believing that they were going to be accepted by white people by fitting themselves into the black box that is socially accepted by white people. And this is how the Negro is spellbound. And what you see in this neighborhoods regarding this Negro is a reflection of who they truly are. When you see these Negro males walking around here in those sagging pants, that relates to their low self-esteem and how they see themselves. When you see these females walking around with these tight pants on or these tight leggings and all this blonde weave in their head, that relates to how she sees herself. And because she has a poor self-image, she is trying to turn herself into a caricaturized white woman, and this black male is trying to turn himself into the thug that many of these white liberals see as acceptable as a black man. And it really shows you a decline in the mindset of the mind of the Afro-American Negro, that they are still trying to fit white into black. Because when you think about, the Jim Crow period, here you had racists calling black people N-words, saying that they were coons, saying that they were dogs, saying that they were monsters. And here were black people saying that we are human beings, we are going to present ourselves as human beings, we are going to act civilly. We're going to have our families be strong families, and we are not going to fit into your stereotypes. But here we have, in the integrated era, the Afro-American and Negro has the freedom to be whatever they want to be. And what are they going to be? They're out here being every stereotype that white racists have pretty much presented regarding black people over the last almost over 100 years. And that's really disturbing because, again, it shows you how deeply spellbound the mind of this Afro-American Negro is. And what you see, again, in these neighborhoods is a reflection of how they see themselves. If you want to learn more about this, you can pick up my new novel, Spellbound, on Amazon.com in paperback and an ebook. And you can also pick it up on other e-reading platforms such as Nook and Smashwords.